These people clearly don't belong in first class. Must have used points or gotten an upgrade. Alexander Reynolds muttered loudly, his voice carrying across the aisle as a well-dressed black family settled into the luxury suite at the center of the cabin. The first-class cabin of Global Ascent Airlines Flight GA547 was Alexander Reynolds' natural habitat. It wasn't just a means of travel. It was an affirmation of his place in the world. The hushed tones, the scent of expensive leather mixed with a hint of jasmine from the hot towels, the deferential smiles from the flight crew. It all reinforced the narrative he had meticulously crafted for his life. As a senior partner at Blackwell Turner & Associates, one of Manhattan's most powerful law firms, Alexander had come to expect a certain level of deference, a recognition of his status that he wore like an invisible crown. Before we dive deeper into this story of arrogance and its consequences, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe in karma and justice, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. At 42, Alexander wasn't just a lawyer. He was a corporate predator, a closer of billion-dollar deals who believed the world was a simple equation of winners and losers. He was unequivocally a winner. His Armani suit, a masterpiece in charcoal gray, hung perfectly on his tall frame. His Rolex Daytona gleamed under the soft cabin lighting, each tick a quiet testament to his exorbitant hourly rate. His Italian leather briefcase contained the final documents for the Harmony Records acquisition, a deal worth $2.4 billion that would be the crown jewel of his career. Alexander's worldview hadn't formed overnight. Born to upper-middle-class parents in Connecticut, he'd attended elite private schools where success was measured by admission to Ivy League universities and eventual income. His father, a banking executive, had drilled into him a simple philosophy: the world was divided into those who mattered and those who served. People like us, his father would say, gesturing around their country club and everyone else. This mentality had been reinforced throughout his education at Yale Law School and his meteoric rise at Blackwell Turner & Associates, where he'd made partner in record time by being ruthlessly effective and utterly remorseless in pursuit of victory. He settled into seat 2A, a spacious pod of privacy and luxury, and accepted a glass of Dom Perignon from a flight attendant whose name he didn't bother to learn. He was flying to London for the final negotiations on the Harmony Records acquisition. The success of this deal rested squarely on his shoulders. He felt the familiar, intoxicating thrum of power in his veins. The last of the first-class passengers began to trickle in. A tech executive he recognized from Forbes, a quiet older woman with a cashmere blanket draped over her lap, a German diplomat. It was the expected cast of characters. People who, like him, had earned their spot at the front of the plane. Alexander scrolled through emails on his phone, occasionally glancing up to assess the newcomers with a practiced eye that categorized them by their apparent worth. Then they boarded. First came the father, a tall man with a calm, easygoing demeanor. He wore a simple, high-quality gray hoodie, comfortable dark jeans, and a pair of stylish but understated sneakers. He was guiding two children, a boy of about 10 and a girl of around 7, who were chattering excitedly but respectfully. The boy clutched a tablet and the girl held a well-loved stuffed elephant. Finally, the mother entered, a striking woman with intelligent eyes and a warm smile. She was dressed similarly to her husband in elegant athleisure wear that prioritized comfort for the 7-hour flight. Alexander watched them over the rim of his champagne flute, a frown tightening his features. They were directed by the flight attendant to the suite of 4 seats in the center of the cabin, the most spacious and coveted arrangement on the aircraft. His frown deepened into a sneer. His mind, conditioned to make snap judgments based on rigid, preconceived notions, went into overdrive. How did they get here? He thought the question laced with disdain. Probably some kind of lottery winners, or maybe he's an athlete who got lucky with a contract. They have no idea how to behave in this environment. Look at them dressed like they're going to a public park. The father, Michael Wilson, helped his daughter Sophia get settled carefully, placing her elephant in the small storage compartment. The son, Jordan, was already absorbed in his tablet, but he looked up to thank his mother, Gabriella, when she handed him a set of noise-canceling headphones. There was a quiet, effortless grace to their interactions, a clear current of familial affection and mutual respect. Alexander saw none of it. He saw only what his prejudice allowed him to see. He saw a family that didn't fit his narrow, bigoted picture of first-class society. He saw a disruption to his carefully curated world. He let out a short, derisive laugh. It was just loud enough to be heard by the passenger across the aisle, a woman who gave him a quizzical look. Alexander ignored her. He leaned slightly towards his window, but his eyes were fixed on the family's reflection in the polished veneer of the cabin wall. The father laughed softly at something the little girl whispered to him, a rich, warm sound that filled their space. To Alexander, it sounded like an intrusion, a violation of the unspoken code of quiet decorum. He flagged down the lead flight attendant, a poised woman in her late 30s named Lucia Ramirez. She had the kind of unflappable professionalism that came from years of dealing with demanding passengers. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds," she asked, her smile polite, but her eyes discerning. "Is the cabin completely full tonight?" Lucia Alexander asked, deliberately, using her name to establish dominance. "Yes, sir. Completely booked in all classes." "I see," he said, gesturing vaguely with his champagne flute towards the Wilson family. "I'm just a bit surprised at the relaxed dress code and the noise level." Jordan had let out a small gasp of excitement at his game. Nothing more than a whisper, but to Alexander it was cannon fire. Lucia's smile didn't waver, but a subtle steely glint entered her eyes. "We don't have a dress code in first class, sir. Only a requirement that our passengers feel comfortable. And the family is not being disruptive." "Not yet," Alexander muttered under his breath as she walked away. He took a deliberate, slow sip of his champagne, the cold bubbles doing nothing to cool the hot indignation simmering in his gut. This was his sanctuary, a reward for his hard work, his intellect, his superiority, and these people were tainting it. He promised himself he wouldn't let it stand. The 7-hour flight to London stretched before him, and he was determined to make his displeasure known. He had no idea that he wasn't just starting a petty on-board dispute. He was pulling the pin on a grenade that would obliterate his entire world. As the aircraft taxied to the runway, the cabin settled into the familiar pre-flight rhythm. Alexander, however, found no peace. Every small sound from the center suite grated on his nerves. The soft crinkle of a snack wrapper, the low murmur of Gabriella reading a book to Sophia, Michael's quiet conversation with Jordan about the mechanics of the airplane wing. Each innocent interaction was in Alexander's warped perception an affront. What Alexander couldn't see, what his prejudice blinded him to, was the extraordinary journey that had brought Michael Wilson to that first-class suite. 30 years earlier, Michael had been a 17-year-old kid from South Chicago with nothing but a second-hand keyboard and an uncanny ear for sound. While Alexander had been attending prep school, Michael had been recording local artists in a converted storage room, charging $20 per session to save for college. When major record labels had rejected his early demos, citing concerns about market fit, a thinly veiled reference to his race, Michael had mortgaged everything to start Harmony Records in his basement. He'd slept on studio floors for years, poured every penny back into equipment, and slowly built a reputation for producing sound that transcended genre. It had taken 15 years of grinding work before his first Grammy nomination, and another 5 before Harmony Records became the powerhouse it was today, home to some of music's most innovative artists and a catalog valued in the billions. Gabriella Wilson's story was equally remarkable. The daughter of Dominican immigrants, she'd worked 3 jobs to put herself through college and graduate school, eventually earning her PhD in child psychology. Her groundbreaking research on resilience in children from marginalized communities had transformed therapeutic approaches worldwide. Her best-selling book, The Compassionate Mind, had been translated into 27 languages and had earned her speaking engagements at prestigious institutions globally. The Wilsons had built their empire not on inheritance or connections, but on talent, perseverance, and vision. The casual clothes they wore reflected not a lack of understanding about first class, but a security in their accomplishments that transcended superficial displays of wealth. None of this was visible to Alexander Reynolds as he glared at them from seat 2A. He was a man who thrived on control. In his world, variables were eliminated. Opposing counsel was intimidated. Judges were swayed by impeccable logic. Subordinates were kept in line with a sharp tongue and the constant threat of dismissal. The Wilson family was an unwelcome variable, a splash of vibrant, unpretentious color on his monochrome canvas of privilege. He pressed the call button again. Lucia appeared almost instantly. "Mr. Reynolds, can I get you anything?" "Another champagne, please," he said, holding out his empty glass. "And I really must insist you speak to them." He didn't nod or gesture this time. He simply let his cold, hard stare drift towards the family. "This isn't a playground. Some of us are trying to work and rest before important business meetings." Michael Wilson, who had overheard the comment, glanced over. He didn't scowl or say a word. He simply met Alexander's gaze with a look that was neither hostile nor fearful, but calmly analytical. It was the kind of look one gives a complex puzzle, and it unnerved Alexander more than any angry retort would have. He felt a flicker of something unfamiliar being assessed, and perhaps being found wanting. He quickly dismissed it as arrogance on the other man's part. Lucia's professional veneer remained intact, but her posture stiffened. "Sir, I can assure you if the family's volume becomes a genuine disturbance, I will address it. At present, they are well within the bounds of acceptable conduct. Your definition of acceptable and mine are clearly at odds." Alexander snapped his voice, a low, venomous hiss. "I pay a small fortune to sit in this seat, and I expect a certain standard of service and atmosphere. If you can't provide it, perhaps I should speak with your purser or the captain." It was a classic power play, the kind that usually sent service staff scurrying to appease him. But Lucia didn't flinch. "I am the cabin purser, Mr. Reynolds, and I will not trouble the captain with a non-existent issue. Your champagne, sir." She placed the fresh glass on his console with a steady hand and walked away, her back ramrod straight. Alexander was seething. To be so calmly defied was a new and infuriating experience. He pulled out his laptop, determined to get some work done to immerse himself in the complex legal architecture of the Harmony Records deal and ignore the family. But he couldn't. His focus was shattered. He found himself listening, waiting for a reason to be angry, to be proven right. He watched as Gabriella took out a sketchbook and began drawing her movements fluid and practiced. He saw Michael reviewing what looked like musical scores on a tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. The children were quiet, absorbed in their own worlds. They weren't loud. They weren't disruptive. They were simply existing, and their calm, self-contained existence was a silent rebuke to his manufactured outrage. His frustration mounted curdling into something uglier. He began constructing a narrative in his head, a story that justified his contempt. They were new money, he decided, flaunting a wealth they hadn't truly earned and didn't know how to handle. He imagined them being loud and obnoxious at a fancy restaurant, cutting lines at the theater, being the very type of people he and his colleagues at the firm mocked in their private dining clubs. Across the aisle, a woman in her early 30s noticed Alexander's persistent glares at the Wilson family. Elena Cortez, a museum curator returning from a New York exhibition, felt a growing unease at his obvious disdain. She'd seen that look before, had been on the receiving end of it herself. As a Hispanic woman who had risen to prominence in a predominantly white field, Elena recognized prejudice when she saw it. Elena observed the Wilson family more closely. The children were well behaved, the parents attentive but not hovering. They were, by any objective measure, ideal passengers. Yet the man in 2A seemed determined to find fault with them. An hour into the flight, lunch service began. Alexander ordered the seared scallops and the filet mignon, pairing them with a glass of expensive Bordeaux. He watched as the Wilsons ordered their meals. The children politely asked for pasta, remembering to say please and thank you. Michael and Gabriella discussed their options with the flight attendant, their conversation easy and pleasant. When Sophia accidentally dropped her fork, it clattered softly on the carpeted floor. "Oopsie," she whispered, her eyes wide. Before Michael or Gabriella could react, Alexander let out an exaggerated theatrical sigh. He rolled his eyes and muttered loud enough for his neighbors to hear, "For God's sake, can't they control their children?" This time Michael Wilson turned his head fully. He looked directly at Alexander, his calm expression finally hardening into something colder. Gabriella placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm, a silent message passing between them. Michael held Alexander's gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment before turning back to his daughter, his voice soft and reassuring. "It's okay, sweetie." "No worries," Michael said, picking up the fork and handing it to Lucia, who had already arrived with a clean one. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees. The other passengers in the vicinity who had been trying to ignore Alexander's behavior now shot him disapproving looks. Elena Cortez across the aisle shook her head slightly, a clear sign of disgust. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quiet but firm, addressing Alexander directly. "That child is behaving better than most adults I know." "Your comment was inappropriate." Alexander stared at her, momentarily shocked that someone would challenge him so directly. "I wasn't speaking to you," he said coldly. "No," Elena replied, unfazed by his tone. "You were speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear about a family that has done nothing wrong. Perhaps you should reconsider your approach." Several other passengers nodded in agreement. Alexander felt a flush of embarrassment quickly transmuted into defensive anger. Who was this woman to lecture him? Nevertheless, he was acutely aware that the social dynamics of the cabin had shifted. He was no longer the powerful figure commanding respect. He was becoming the villain in a story unfolding in real time. Despite this, Alexander felt a perverse sense of satisfaction. He had finally gotten a reaction. He had pierced their infuriating calm. He mistook their restraint for weakness, their dignity for cowardice. He leaned back, sipping his wine, feeling a smug sense of victory. He was so blinded by his prejudice that he failed to notice a key detail. He didn't see the way Lucia's eyes lingered on Michael Wilson, not just with professional courtesy, but with a flicker of genuine respect and recognition. He didn't see the passenger in seat 3B, a young man with a guitar case stowed in the overhead bin, staring at Michael Wilson with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. Alexander saw a man in a hoodie who didn't belong. He had no idea he was looking at a kingmaker, a cultural icon whose influence stretched from recording studios in Los Angeles to concert halls in Tokyo. He was an ant shouting at a giant completely oblivious to the shadow falling over him. In the row behind the Wilsons, James Thompson, a tech journalist returning from covering a New York conference, had been quietly observing the entire exchange. He discreetly took out his phone and began recording. He wasn't a tabloid reporter or a scandalmonger, but he had a strong sense of justice and an active social media presence. What he was witnessing deserved documentation. "Unbelievable," he whispered to himself as he captured Alexander's disdainful expression. "Guy in 2A has been harassing this family since takeoff." Beside him, an elderly woman nodded in agreement. "Disgraceful behavior. That family hasn't done anything wrong." James continued filming, careful to keep his phone partially hidden. He wasn't just creating content, he was preserving evidence of something ugly, something that deserved to be called out. What he didn't know was that his video would soon become a pivotal piece in a much larger story. The tipping point arrived as the flight crew began to clear the remnants of the lunch service. Alexander, emboldened by the wine and his own self-righteousness, was preparing another complaint. He was mentally rehearsing a speech about maintaining brand integrity and catering to your core clientele. That's when the young man from seat 3B stood up. He was in his early 20s with an anxious energy and eyes that shone with the fervor of a true believer. He clutched a small notebook and a pen, his knuckles white. He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and approached the Wilson suite. Alexander watched a smirk playing on his lips. Here we go, he thought, probably going to ask for a handout or try to sell them something. The young man stopped beside Michael Wilson's seat, looking utterly starstruck. Excuse me, Mr. Wilson. I am so sorry to bother you. My name is Tyler Roberts. I had to say thank you. Michael looked up from his tablet, his expression softening at the young man's obvious sincerity. Hello, Tyler. It's no trouble. For what? Tyler stammered, his voice cracking with emotion. Your production on Echoes in the Static. It changed my life. I'm a musician, and the way you layer sound, the way you build atmosphere, it's genius. Pure genius. I'm studying at the Royal Academy of Music in London, and it's because of you. You're the reason I play. Alexander's smirk froze on his face. Wilson. The name echoed in his mind, colliding with another piece of information, Harmony Records. The founder, the creative force, the legendary producer behind Harmony Records was the reclusive, press-shy genius Michael Wilson. It was like a switch being flipped in a dark room, suddenly illuminating a terrifying landscape. The man in the gray hoodie was not some lottery winner. He was Michael Wilson, the architect of modern music. A man with a net worth that dwarfed Alexander's own by a factor of 1,000. A man who held the key to the $2.4 billion deal that was supposed to be the capstone of Alexander Reynolds' career. A wave of nausea washed over him so intense, he felt the blood drain from his face. The seared scallops and filet mignon churned in his stomach. He looked at Michael Wilson again, but he was seeing him for the first time. He saw the quiet confidence not as arrogance, but as the earned assurance of a man at the absolute pinnacle of his field. He saw the simple clothing not as a sign of being out of place, but as the choice of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. He saw the woman Gabriella Wilson, and a fragmented memory from a New York Times bestseller list surfaced. Dr. Gabriella Wilson, the celebrated child psychologist and author of The Compassionate Mind, a book his own fiancée had on her nightstand. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a coffin lid closing. Michael smiled warmly at the young musician. Thank you, Tyler. That means a lot to me. Keep working hard. The world needs more music. Could you possibly? Tyler asked, holding out his notebook with a trembling hand. Of course, Michael said, taking the pen. While this exchange was happening, Alexander's world was collapsing in on itself. Every sneer, every muttered insult, every condescending look he had directed at this family replayed in his mind, now drenched in the horrifying context of his monumental blunder. He hadn't just been rude. He had been a fool. He had performed his bigotry on a stage for a man who held his entire professional future in the palm of his hand. Lucia, who had been observing from the galley, saw the look of dawning horror on Alexander's face. She approached his seat, her expression now devoid of any forced politeness. It was a look of cold, professional satisfaction. Is everything all right, Mr. Reynolds? She asked, her voice neutral, but her eyes conveyed a clear message. You have made a grave mistake. Alexander could only stare at her, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. He felt sweat bead on his forehead. The carefully constructed edifice of his superiority had been pulverized into dust. Across the aisle, Elena Cortez, who had shaken her head in disgust, now looked at Alexander with an expression of pure, unadulterated schadenfreude. She had clearly put it all together as well. Alexander Reynolds, the master of the universe, the shark of the boardroom, felt small. For the first time in his adult life, he was utterly, hopelessly powerless. He was trapped in a pressurized metal tube, 35,000 feet in the air, with the man he had just spent 2 hours insulting. And on Monday morning he was scheduled to walk into a London boardroom and ask that same man to entrust his company's legacy to him. Meanwhile, James Thompson had captured the entire revelation on video, Alexander's shocked expression, the moment of recognition, the color draining from his face. He had even caught Tyler's excited exchange with Michael, which made the identity of the Wilson family undeniable. As soon as the plane's Wi-Fi became available, he uploaded a 90-second clip to Twitter with the caption, "Witness this businessman repeatedly harasses black family in first class, then discovers their music legend Michael Wilson and Dr. Gabriella Wilson. His face when he realizes who they are equals priceless. First class. Racism, Michael Wilson, karma, is real." Within minutes, the video began to gain traction. Other passengers, now aware of the Wilsons' identity, discreetly took photos that soon appeared across social platforms. A well-known pop star retweeted the video with the comment, "Michael Wilson is a legend who deserves nothing but respect. This is what privilege and prejudice look like." A prominent civil rights activist shared it, adding, "This isn't just about celebrities. This happens to black families every day. Just most don't have the protection of fame." The flight to London had 4 more hours to go. For Alexander Reynolds, it was a descent into hell. The remaining hours of the flight were the longest of Alexander's life. The luxurious first-class pod, once his throne, now felt like a prison cell. The air, once perfumed with exclusivity, was now thick with his humiliation. He couldn't work. The legal jargon on his laptop screen swam before his eyes, meaningless symbols of a future that was rapidly evaporating. He couldn't relax. Every rustle of a blanket, every soft word exchanged in the Wilsons' suite was a fresh torment. He kept replaying the events in his head, each memory, a new stab of regret. His derisive laugh, his sneering complaint to Lucia, the way he had rolled his eyes when the little girl dropped her fork. He had judged a king by his robes and, in his arrogance, had revealed himself to be a pathetic court jester. About an hour after the revelation, he knew he had to do something. He couldn't just sit there. He had to apologize. It wasn't born of genuine remorse for his prejudice, but of a desperate, panicked instinct for self-preservation. He had to salvage the Harmony deal. He had to save himself. He unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements stiff and awkward. He stood up, smoothed his suit jacket, and walked the few steps to the Wilson suite. It felt like walking a mile across a battlefield. Michael was now wearing reading glasses and looking over some documents. Gabriella was dozing, her head resting on a pillow. The children were both asleep, their faces peaceful. Alexander cleared his throat softly. "Mr. Wilson." Michael looked up, his expression unreadable. He took off his glasses and gave Alexander his full attention. The calm, analytical gaze was back, and it made Alexander's skin crawl. I am Alexander Reynolds," he began, his voice sounding strained and foreign to his own ears. "I wanted to offer my most sincere and profound apologies for my behavior earlier. I was inexcusably rude." "There's no excuse. I was stressed, tired from a long week, but that's no justification." He was fumbling the words, clumsy and hollow. He was a man used to commanding a room, to bending others to his will with sharp, precise language. Now he sounded like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Michael Wilson listened patiently, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't interrupt. He simply let Alexander stumble through his pathetic, self-serving apology. "I had no idea who you were," Alexander blurted out. And the moment the words left his mouth, he knew he had made another catastrophic error. He had just admitted that his apology was conditional, that his respect was reserved for status, not for basic human decency. A flicker of something disappointment perhaps crossed Michael's face. "So, if I were someone else," he asked, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight, "if I were a plumber or a teacher, or just a man taking his family on vacation, your behavior would have been acceptable to you?" Alexander's face flushed a deep, painful red. No, of course not. I just meant I was out of line completely." "You were," Michael agreed, his voice still calm but now with an edge of steel. "You were out of line. You made assumptions about my family based on our appearance. You were loud and disruptive in your complaints about our supposed disruption. You tried to intimidate the cabin crew, and you made my children, who were being perfectly well-behaved, feel uncomfortable." He paused, letting the indictment hang in the air. "My wife and I have worked very hard to build our careers, Mr. Reynolds, but the most important job we have is raising our children to be good, kind people. People who don't judge others based on what they wear or the color of their skin. We teach them to treat everyone with respect, from the CEO to the janitor. It's a lesson you seem to have missed." Alexander felt about 2 inches tall. He had nothing to say. There was no legal argument, no clever rebuttal that could save him. He had been stripped bare, his ugly prejudices exposed to the world. "Your apology, Mr. Reynolds." Michael continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is noted, but it is not accepted. Not because I wish to be cruel, but because it is not genuine. It is born of panic, not principle. You are not sorry for what you thought. You are sorry for who you said it to. There is a profound difference." He picked up his reading glasses, a clear gesture of dismissal. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to get back to my work. I hope you have a pleasant rest of the flight." Alexander stood there for a moment longer, desperate to salvage something, anything from the wreckage. "Mr. Wilson, I know our firms have a meeting scheduled for Monday. I hope that meeting will proceed as planned," Michael interrupted, not looking up from his documents. "I make business decisions based on data and strategy, not personal feelings. But I do consider character to be relevant data, Mr. Reynolds. Very relevant." The dismissal was clear. Defeated, Alexander retreated to his seat. The polite, devastatingly precise rejection was worse than any shouting match. He slumped into his chair, the luxurious leather offering no comfort. He was a dead man flying. He pulled the cashmere blanket up to his chin, but a deep, unshakable chill had settled into his bones. What Alexander didn't know was that his public humiliation had been captured. James Thompson, the tech journalist, had recorded the entire apology attempt. He hadn't intended to post it initially, but the sheer arrogance of Alexander's non-apology, "I had no idea who you were," had changed his mind. As soon as the plane's Wi-Fi service allowed, he uploaded the full exchange as a follow-up to his initial tweet. Update. Watch the non-apology. "I had no idea who you were" tells you everything you need to know. Michael Wilson's response is masterful. #first-class racism. Michael Wilson. The compassionate mind. By the time the plane began its descent into London Heathrow, the video had already amassed 200,000 views and was climbing exponentially. The hashtag #first-class-racism was trending nationally, with celebrities, civil rights leaders, and everyday people sharing their own experiences of being judged by their appearance. A prominent news anchor tweeted, "Michael Wilson's calm dignity in the face of blatant prejudice is a masterclass in grace under pressure." A well-known actress added, "I've been in first class with my kids and gotten those exact same looks. The only difference is I couldn't shut it down like Michael Wilson. This happens every day." The story was rapidly evolving from a viral moment into a cultural conversation about prejudice, power, and accountability. Alexander didn't sleep a wink for the remainder of the flight. He just stared out the window at the endless, indifferent darkness, watching the first faint hints of dawn break over the horizon. A dawn that promised a new day he now wished would never come. The descent into London Heathrow was, for Alexander, a descent into a personal abyss. The familiar morning light over the English countryside seemed gray and foreboding. The gentle chime signaling the final approach sounded like a death knell. As the wheels touched the tarmac with a soft bump, a jolt went through him. This was it. The bubble had burst. Reality was no longer 35,000 feet away. It was right here on the ground, waiting for him. He remained in his seat as the other first-class passengers began to disembark. He wanted to delay the inevitable, to hide in his pod for just a few more minutes. He watched the Wilson family gather their things. They were as calm and unhurried as they had been upon boarding. Michael helped Jordan with his backpack. Gabriella gently woke a sleepy Sophia who clutched her elephant tightly. They moved with the quiet efficiency of a family that loved and supported one another. As they passed his seat, none of them looked at him. To them, he had already ceased to exist. It was the most profound invisibility he had ever experienced. Finally, he forced himself to move. He collected his briefcase, his hands trembling slightly. As he stepped off the plane, the London air felt heavy and damp. He navigated through the terminal on autopilot, the usual sense of purpose and direction completely gone. He was a ghost haunting the corridors of his former life. As he waited for his luggage at the carousel, his phone, now reconnected to the network, exploded with notifications. The voicemail indicator showed 7 missed calls from his partners in London. His email inbox was filling at an alarming rate, and his social media accounts, which he maintained but rarely used, were being flooded with mentions. With growing dread, he opened Twitter to find that he was trending. The video of his interaction with the Wilsons had been viewed over 2 million times in just a few hours. The comment section was a tribunal, and the verdict was unanimous. He was the villain of this story. This is what entitled racism looks like. Imagine thinking you own first class. I had no idea who you were. Ixals, I only respect people with status. Michael Wilson handled this masterfully. Prominent voices across industries were weighing in. A well-known legal ethics professor had tweeted, "This is a case study in how not to conduct yourself as an attorney. Professionalism extends beyond the courtroom." Even more alarming were the emails from his firm. The subject lines told the story. Urgent Wilson Video Crisis Management Call. Mandatory PR Statement. Needed. ASAP. Partners. Emergency Meeting. He checked into his suite at the Savoy, a place that usually made him feel powerful and pampered. Today, the opulent decor felt garish, the attentive staff intrusive. He stood in the middle of the vast living room overlooking the Thames and felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The deal. The Harmony Records acquisition. It was scheduled for Monday morning, less than 48 hours away. A sliver of desperate, irrational hope began to form in his mind. Maybe he won't connect the dots, he thought. Michael Wilson is a creative genius, a big-picture guy. He doesn't get involved in the nitty-gritty of legal negotiations. He'll send his executives, his lawyers. He won't even be there. He'll forget all about the man on the plane. This flimsy hope became his lifeline. He clung to it throughout the weekend. He tried to work to prepare. He spread the deal documents across the antique mahogany desk, trying to immerse himself in the familiar world of clauses, liabilities, and indemnifications. But Michael Wilson's face, his calm, disappointed eyes, kept superimposing itself over the legal text. The words of his dismissal echoed in the silent room. "You are not sorry for what you thought. You are sorry for who you said it to." Meanwhile, across London, in a sleek penthouse apartment overlooking the city, Michael Wilson was having a very different morning. He sat at a glass table tablet in hand, scrolling through the viral video that had exploded overnight. It was himself and Alexander Reynolds captured in high definition, the entire exchange preserved for posterity. James Thompson's video had been picked up by major news outlets. It had been retweeted by celebrities, commented on by social justice advocates, and dissected by cultural critics. In less than 12 hours, it had amassed over 10 million views. The comments section was a unanimous jury, and the verdict was damning for Alexander Reynolds. This is what privilege looks like. That non-apology is everything wrong with corporate America. I had no idea who you were, translation. I only respect people with status. Michael Wilson's response was pure class. Michael sighed, setting down his tablet. This wasn't what he had wanted. He hadn't asked for the video to be taken, hadn't sought this public spectacle. But he also recognized that this moment had resonated with millions because it reflected a truth that needed to be acknowledged. His phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer, Sophia Nguyen. Have you seen the video? How do you want to handle the meeting tomorrow? Michael thought for a moment, then typed back, I'll be there in person. No change in plans. He set down his phone and looked out at the London skyline, the city coming alive in the morning light. He had built his career on the belief that music could bridge divides, that art could create understanding. But he also knew that sometimes a clear boundary needed to be drawn, a message needed to be sent. Tomorrow's meeting with Blackwell, Turner and Associates would be that message. Gabriella joined him on the balcony, wrapped in a robe, her face concerned. I saw the video is everywhere, she said quietly. How do you feel about that? Michael considered the question. Conflicted, he admitted. I didn't want our family to become some viral object lesson, but if it starts a conversation about how people are treated... He trailed off, then continued. I just wish people could see each other as human first before all the other labels. Gabriella nodded, understanding. As a psychologist who had worked extensively with children affected by prejudice, she knew better than most the damage that casual bigotry could inflict. What will you do about the meeting tomorrow? She asked. I'll go, Michael said simply, and I'll make a decision based on what I believe is right for Harmony, for our artists, and for the legacy we're building. Nothing more, nothing less. Back at the Savoy, Alexander called his fiancée, Victoria Phillips, hoping her voice might ground him. Alexander. Darling, how was the flight? She asked, her voice crisp and cheerful. Fine. Uneventful. He lied. He couldn't possibly tell her the truth. Victoria was attracted to his power, his status, his success. She had no tolerance for weakness or failure. To tell her what happened would be to admit a catastrophic lapse in judgment, a fatal chink in his armor. Excellent, she said. Just close this Harmony deal and come home a hero. I saw the most divine diamond bracelet at Tiffany's today. Consider it a celebratory gift for me. The call ended, leaving him feeling emptier than before. His relationship, his career, his entire life was built on the foundation of being Alexander Reynolds the winner. If that foundation cracked, everything would come tumbling down. On Sunday night, sleep offered no escape. He tossed and turned his mind a feverish carousel of disastrous scenarios. He dreamt he was in the boardroom, but instead of lawyers, the room was filled with the Wilson family. Sophia sat at the head of the table holding her stuffed elephant, and in a small, clear voice she said, No deal. You were mean. He woke up in a cold sweat just before his 600 a.m. alarm. He stood under a scalding shower for 20 minutes trying to wash away the fear. He put on his most formidable suit, a bespoke navy pinstripe from Savile Row. He tied his tie with military precision. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, trying to conjure the old Alexander, the confident, ruthless shark. But the eyes that stared back were haunted, filled with the terror of an animal caught in a trap of its own making. Alexander took a black car to the offices of Blackwell Turner and Associates in Canary Wharf. His London-based partners, Lawrence Williams and David Taylor, were waiting for him. Their expressions were grim, their greetings perfunctory. Alexander Lawrence said his usual booming enthusiasm replaced by a terse nod. "We need to talk before the meeting. If this is about the video Alexander began attempting damage control, I can explain." "There's nothing to explain." David cut, in his voice cold. "We've seen it. Everyone's seen it. The question is how we salvage this situation." Lawrence's expression was grave. "The Harmony team will be here in 30 minutes. We've prepared contingency plans. I'll take the lead on the presentation. You'll be present but silent. If Wilson brings up the incident, we'll acknowledge it, express the firm's regret, and move forward. Is that clear?" Alexander felt a flare of resentment. This was his deal. He had spent months crafting every detail. Now he was being sidelined. But he was in no position to object. "Clear," he said tightly. As they walked down the marble hallway toward the main conference room, Alexander felt a chilling certainty. He wasn't walking towards the greatest triumph of his career. He was walking to his own execution. The main conference room at Blackwell Turner and Associates was a monument to corporate conquest. Perched on the 48th floor of a Canary Wharf skyscraper, its floor-to-ceiling windows presented a godlike panorama of London. The centerpiece was a 30-foot table of polished monolithic mahogany, so dark and reflective it seemed to hold the city's skyline captive on its surface. On any other day, this room was Alexander's sanctuary, the arena where he had slain corporate dragons and cemented his reputation. Today, however, it felt like a beautifully appointed execution chamber, and he was the guest of honor. He took his seat, not at the head of the table, but to Lawrence's right, a clear demotion that was not lost on the junior associates filing in with their notebooks and tablets. The leather of the chair was cool and supple, but it offered no comfort. He felt a clammy sweat on his palms and surreptitiously wiped them on his trousers. His partners, Lawrence and David, flanked him, their faces stone masks that betrayed nothing of the crisis they were navigating. "The final documents are prepared," Lawrence said to the assembled team, deliberately not acknowledging Alexander's role in their creation. "Let's focus on the core terms and be prepared to address any concerns about valuation." Alexander wanted to speak, to assert himself, to remind everyone that this was his deal, his triumph. But he remained silent. He had become a liability, not an asset, and he knew it. At precisely 10:00 a.m., the grand double doors of the conference room swung silently open. A woman in a sharp, dark gray business suit entered, followed by a younger male associate. Alexander's heart leaped with a wild, irrational flicker of relief. It was just the lawyers, no Wilson. Perhaps he would survive this after all. The woman, presumably Ms. Nguyen, walked with a confident stride, her expression professional and unreadable. But she stopped just inside the room, turning back toward the doorway as if waiting for someone. And then he entered. Michael Wilson stepped into the room, and it was as if the atmospheric pressure instantly changed. Gone was the man in the simple hoodie and jeans. In his place stood a titan of industry, dressed in an exquisitely tailored navy suit that fit him with the ease of a second skin. He wasn't loud or ostentatious, but he commanded the room with an aura of quiet, unassailable authority that made every other powerful man in that space, Alexander included, seem like a boy playing dress-up. His eyes, the same calm, analytical eyes from the plane, swept across the room and settled on Alexander. There was no flicker of surprise, no hint of anger. There was only a cool, level acknowledgement that was more terrifying than any outburst could ever be. In that single, silent glance, Alexander knew this was no coincidence. This was a reckoning. Lawrence, doing his best to salvage the situation, rose to his feet, his face beaming with a politician's practiced warmth. "Mr. Wilson, what an unexpected honor. We weren't certain you'd be joining us. I'm Lawrence Williams, senior partner. And this is my partner, David Taylor. And of course, you must know our lead on this deal, Alexander Reynolds." With a grand, sweeping gesture, Lawrence presented Alexander as if he were the prize exhibit. Michael Wilson's gaze remained locked on Alexander as he walked slowly, deliberately toward the table. He didn't approach the waiting chairs or extend a hand to the effusive Lawrence. He stopped a few feet away, a silent, powerful statue. "Yes," Michael said, his voice perfectly modulated but filling the suddenly cavernous silence of the room. "I know Mr. Reynolds. We flew over together on Friday." The statement landed not like a bomb but like a shard of ice. It was innocuous on the surface, yet freighted with a chilling significance that no one but Alexander could fully comprehend. Lawrence and David exchanged a confused glance, their smiles faltering. They could sense the sudden, inexplicable frost in the air. The junior associates on Alexander's team shuffled their papers, their eyes darting from their boss to the billionaire who was staring him down. Michael remained standing, a deliberate choice that kept him in a position of power. He placed his hands on the back of an empty chair. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid I have to apologize." He began, his tone polite but firm. "It seems we've all wasted a trip this morning. We won't be needing your services today or any day in the future." A collective, audible gasp went through the Blackwell, Turner and Associates team. Lawrence's jaw literally dropped. I don't understand, Mr. Wilson," he stammered, the color draining from his face. "The deal is all but finalized. We've worked on this for 6 months. Our terms are exactly what you asked for. Is there a last-minute issue? Your legal terms are fine. Miss Nguyen has assured me of that." Michael set his eyes, still boring into Alexander, pinning him to his chair. "My issue isn't with the paperwork. It's with the character of the people I'd be getting into business with." He let that indictment hang in the air, heavy and damning. He then turned his gaze from Alexander and addressed the entire stunned room. "I founded Harmony Records from a tiny studio in my basement 30 years ago." He continued, his voice resonating with a quiet passion that was utterly captivating. "It's more than a business to me. It is a culture. It is a family of artists and professionals built on mutual respect. It is my life's work, and I will not under any circumstances entrust its future to a firm represented by a man like Mr. Reynolds." He looked directly at Alexander again. "On our flight to London, I had the profound displeasure of witnessing Mr. Reynolds treat my wife and my 2 young children with a level of contempt and prejudice I find utterly sickening. He judged us, sneered at us, and complained about us all because we didn't fit his narrow, bigoted idea of who should be allowed to share his airspace. He is a man who measures human worth by the brand of a suit or the color of a person's skin." Alexander felt as if the floor had fallen away, leaving him in a free fall. He was being vivisected, his rotten core laid bare in front of his partners, his team, his entire professional world. He could feel the heat of their stares, could see the dawning comprehension and horror on their faces. In a desperate last-ditch effort to salvage something, Alexander stood up, his legs barely supporting him. "Mr. Wilson, I deeply regret my behavior on the flight. It was inexcusable. But this deal represents months of work by dozens of people. It's advantageous for both parties. Surely we can separate personal matters from..." "That's exactly the problem, Mr. Reynolds." Michael interrupted, his voice calm but cutting. "You think respect is a personal matter rather than a foundational principle. You think you can compartmentalize your prejudice, turn it on and off like a switch. But character isn't divisible. It's whole. And yours has revealed itself." Alexander sank back into his chair, defeated. His attempt at damage control had only dug the hole deeper. Michael wasn't finished. "Your firm's motto, I believe, is integrity, diligence, victory. An admirable sentiment. But you cannot have victory without integrity. It's the foundation upon which all lasting success is built. And integrity is not something you seem to understand, Mr. Reynolds. You don't just lack it. You are antithetical to it. He pushed the chair he was holding gently back toward the table, the small sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. The deal is off. We will be taking our business to a firm that understands that decency isn't a weakness and respect isn't a currency to be spent only on the powerful. Good day, gentlemen. And with that, Michael Wilson turned his team falling in behind him and walked out of the room. The doors closed with a soft, final click, a sound that sealed Alexander's fate as surely as a tomb. The silence that followed was a physical presence. It was thick with shame fury and the smell of $2.4 billion burning. Everyone stared at Alexander, who sat paralyzed, the blood roaring in his ears. His meticulously constructed world had been dismantled and destroyed in less than 5 minutes. It was Lawrence who finally broke the silence. His voice was no longer booming or angry, but a low, trembling whisper of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He looked at the man he had championed just moments before, now a hollowed-out pariah. "Alexander," he said, his voice cracking on the single word. "What did you do?" The immediate aftermath of Michael Wilson's departure was a vacuum, a terrifying void where the electric anticipation of moments before had been. The heavy conference room doors clicked shut, and the sound seemed to suck all the air from the room. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of the city outside the panoramic windows, a world that was suddenly, irrevocably alien to Alexander. He sat frozen, the blood in his veins turning to ice. His partners, Lawrence and David, and the entire legal team stared at him, their faces a gallery of disbelief morphing in slow motion into a unified mask of horror and fury. What did he mean? Alexander. David finally asked, his voice strained. "What happened on that plane?" Alexander opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His throat was desert dry. How could he explain? How could he possibly frame his behavior in a way that wouldn't destroy the last threads of his professional reputation? Before he could formulate a response, Lawrence's personal assistant burst into the room, tablet in hand, her face pale with urgency. "Sir, you need to see this. It's all over social media." She placed the tablet in front of Lawrence. The screen showed a video, the viral clip of Alexander's confrontation with Michael Wilson on the plane. Lawrence and David huddled over the device, their expressions darkening with each passing second. The younger associates pulled out their phones, finding the same footage replicated across platforms. The video had exploded beyond Twitter, spreading to Instagram, Facebook, and major news sites. Major networks were running segments on the incident. The hashtag #FirstClassRacism was trending globally, with millions sharing their own experiences of prejudice. Well-known musicians were releasing statements of support for Michael Wilson, praising his dignity and calling out Alexander's behavior. The crisis had transcended social media to become a full-blown cultural moment, with Alexander as its unwilling villain. "I had no idea who you were," Lawrence quoted, looking up at Alexander with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. "That was your apology, to say you wouldn't have been an absolute bigot if you'd known he was Michael Wilson." The room erupted into chaos. Associates whispered urgently to each other. Phones buzzed with incoming messages. Lawrence and David stepped away from the table, conferring in heated, hushed tones. Alexander remained in his chair, the center of a storm he had created. "This isn't just about the deal," David muttered to Lawrence loudly enough for Alexander to hear. "This is an existential threat to the firm. We're being painted as a haven for entitled bigots." "The damage control will be astronomical," Lawrence agreed. "And that's assuming we can salvage anything at all." They turned back to Alexander, their expressions hardened into stone. "My office." Now Lawrence ordered. The walk from the conference room back to Lawrence's private corner office was the longest of Alexander's life. The polished marble floors, usually a pathway to power, felt like a green mile. The whispers started instantly, a sibilant tide rising from the junior associates and paralegals in the open plan areas. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, not with sympathy, but with the morbid, ravenous curiosity of a crowd watching a public shaming. He was no longer Alexander Reynolds, the formidable senior partner. He was a spectacle, a cautionary tale being born in real time. Inside the office, the thick oak door was slammed shut. The sound a sharp crack of doom. The pretense of civility was gone. Lawrence, a man whose bonhomie was legendary, was transformed. His face was a thundercloud of purple rage, a $2.4 billion deal. "Alexander," he roared, his voice, usually so smooth and persuasive, now a ragged, guttural weapon. He slammed a fist on his desk, rattling a row of silver-framed family photos. The biggest acquisition in the 120-year history of this firm. Gone. Evaporated. Because you couldn't keep your mouth shut on an airplane. Alexander flinched as if struck. He tried to speak to Marshall, the formidable legal mind that had won countless battles. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. His brain, his greatest asset, was a traitor replaying Michael Wilson's calm, cutting words on an endless loop. "I can fix this." He finally managed the words hollow even to his own ears. "I can reach out to Wilson personally, explain." Explain what? Lawrence interrupted, his voice dripping with scorn. "That you're not really a bigot, that you just play one on airplanes. The entire world has seen who you really are, Alexander. There's no spinning this." "What were you thinking?" David interjected, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. He was pacing like a caged animal, insulting Michael Wilson's family. "Michael Wilson, have you lost your mind? The reputational damage, my God. Alexander, this is on every financial blog, every news site. Our clients are calling. Our competitors are circling like sharks. We're a laughingstock." It was a misunderstanding. Alexander finally managed to choke out the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. It was a pathetic defense, and he knew it. "A misunderstanding." Lawrence laughed, a harsh, brutal sound, devoid of any humor. He leaned across his desk, his eyes boring into Alexander's. "It sounded perfectly clear to me, Alexander. Wilson doesn't just think you're a bad lawyer. He thinks you're a bad person. His exact words were that you are antithetical to integrity. And after seeing this, so do we. You have made this entire firm look like a haven for arrogant, prejudiced fools." The accusation struck deeper than the loss of the deal. He had always believed his arrogance was a tool and necessary component of his success. He had never considered it a character flaw, a rot that could bring the whole structure down. "I've already spoken with the other senior partners." Lawrence continued, his voice now cold and clinical. "They're in agreement. This goes beyond a professional lapse. This is a values breach. You've violated everything this firm stands for. The final judgment was delivered with the cold finality of a death sentence. You're fired, Alexander," Lawrence said, the roar gone, replaced by a voice as flat and hard as granite. "Effective immediately. Security will escort you to your office. Pack your personal effects. You have 1 hour." Alexander felt a surge of desperate anger. "You can't do this. I'm a senior partner. I have rights. I have a contract." "Check the morals clause," David said quietly. "Behavior that brings the firm into public disrepute." "You're done, Alexander." There was no severance negotiation, no discussion of his partnership stake, no dignified exit strategy. He was being excised like a tumor. As 2 stony-faced security guards appeared at the office door, Alexander finally understood he wasn't just losing a job. He was being erased from a world he had clawed his way to the top of. Packing his office was a surreal, humiliating ritual. The objects that had once been trophies of his success were now artifacts of his failure. A framed photo of him and Victoria at a charity gala, their smiles brilliant and false. A lucite block entombing the announcement of a landmark merger he had orchestrated 5 years ago. His leather-bound planner filled with future meetings that would never happen. He packed them all into a plain cardboard box, each item a fresh sting of humiliation. When he walked out, box in hand, the office was silent. No one met his eye. He was a ghost. At the security desk, his ID badge, his key to this kingdom, was unceremoniously snipped in half. The click of the scissors was the sound of his old life ending. Outside, the London weather had turned as if in sympathy with his fall. A cold, penetrating rain soaked him as he stood on the curb waiting for a taxi. His phone buzzed with an email notification. With numb fingers, he unlocked the screen to find a message from Lawrence's assistant, Mr. Reynolds. Per the termination of your employment with Blackwell Turner and Associates, we have canceled your return flight to New York. Your hotel reservation at the Savoy has been terminated effective today. A courier will collect any firm property from your hotel room. Please make alternative arrangements for your return travel. Regards. The flight back to New York was a masterclass in cosmic irony. The airline, seeing his ticket had been abruptly canceled by his former firm, had only one seat available, 28B, a middle seat in economy. For 7 hours he was wedged between a large, snoring man, whose shoulder became his unwilling pillow, and a young mother with a fussy, wailing baby. The air was stale, the space suffocating. The experience was a perfect, brutal metaphor for his new reality. He who had sneered at a family in a first-class suite was now trapped in the humbling reality of the masses he had so long despised. Throughout the flight, he caught people staring at him, then quickly looking away. A few whispered to their neighbors, pointing discreetly. He realized with horror that he was being recognized from the video, which had now amassed over 30 million views. His shame was no longer private. It had become a public spectacle, a morality tale for the digital age. He arrived at his pristine Manhattan apartment just after midnight, numb with exhaustion and dread. He had rehearsed a speech for Victoria, a carefully edited version of events that painted him as a victim of corporate politics. But the moment he walked in, he knew his lies would be useless. The apartment, usually a silent minimalist sanctuary, was in disarray. Half-empty closets gaped open. 3 Louis Vuitton suitcases, symbols of a life he could no longer afford, lay open on their bed. Victoria was packing. "I can't believe you, Alexander," she said, her voice sharp and brittle. She didn't look at him, focusing with intense precision on folding a silk dress. "I knew you were arrogant, but I never thought you were this stupid." "Victoria, please let me explain." "Explain what?" she snapped, finally turning to face him, her beautiful face, which he had once considered one of his finest acquisitions, a mask of cold fury. "That you blew the biggest deal of your life because you decided to pick on some random family on a plane. And it turns out they're not just some family, but the goddamn Wilsons. You're a laughingstock. I got 3 calls about it before your plane even landed. My father called. He was displeased. Her cruelty was a surgeon's scalpel, precise and deep. I was with you for your power, Alexander, for your success, for the life you provided, the penthouse, the galas, the respect. You don't have that anymore. You're not just fired. You're finished. No reputable firm in this city will touch you after this. You're radioactive." She zipped her last bag with a vicious tug and walked toward the door, pulling it on its wheels. She paused at the threshold, not for a moment of sentiment, but for one last, devastating blow. "That Tiffany's bracelet I mentioned, I bought it myself this afternoon on your black card before it gets declined. Consider it a parting gift. Goodbye, Alexander." The door slammed shut. The sound echoed in the cavernous apartment, a final deafening punctuation mark on his utter desolation. He was alone. In the weeks that followed, Victoria's prediction proved horrifyingly accurate. The story of Alexander Reynolds's downfall became an infamous piece of Wall Street lore. He was a punchline, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones over martini lunches. The video of his airplane confrontation with Michael Wilson continued its viral trajectory. A prominent late-night host had featured it in his monologue, roasting Alexander's non-apology to thunderous audience laughter. Opinion pieces dissected it as a case study in privilege and prejudice. Law schools used it in ethics classes as a real-time example of professional conduct gone catastrophically wrong. Within the legal community, his name became toxic. A major legal blog ran a series titled The Reynolds Effect, When Personal Conduct Destroys Professional Value. Former colleagues who once courted his favor now denied ever having been close to him. The same partners who had celebrated his aggressive tactics now condemned them as signs of a deeper character flaw they claimed they'd always suspected. His calls to headhunters went unreturned. Interviews were polite, brief, and always ended with a variation of, "We'll be in touch." One firm more candid than the rest put it bluntly, "The optics would be disastrous. We can't risk the association." Meanwhile, Michael Wilson's reputation soared. The grace and dignity he had shown in the face of Alexander's prejudice had elevated him from respected industry figure to cultural icon. Profiles emphasized his journey from a basement studio to industry leadership, his commitment to artist rights, and his philanthropic work. Gabriella's book, The Compassionate Mind, shot to the top of bestseller lists, with readers finding new relevance in her insights about empathy and respect. The Wilson family had made no public statements about the incident, which only enhanced their standing. Their silence was interpreted as class, as a refusal to capitalize on another's downfall. In reality, Michael had simply moved on to what mattered more: the music, the artists, and his family. The deal Alexander had lost was quickly picked up by Montgomery & Reed, a rival firm that had long courted Harmony Records. They closed at $2.6 billion, $200 million more than what Alexander had negotiated. The news was like salt in an open wound. He was forced to sell the apartment, the Rolex watch, the art, the Armani suits. Everything that had defined him was liquidated to cover his debts. The luxury items that had once seemed essential revealed themselves to be dead weight anchors, dragging him toward financial ruin. 6 weeks after the incident, Alexander found himself sitting in a nondescript coffee shop in Queens, scrolling through job listings on his laptop. His $5 million Manhattan penthouse had been replaced by a small third-floor walk-up with peeling paint and a view of a brick wall. His $3,000 suits had given way to off-the-rack basics. His black American Express card, once a symbol of his limitless purchasing power, was now a memory. He was doing freelance contract reviews for a fraction of his former rate. The work was tedious and soul-crushing, the legal equivalent of fast food service, but it was all he could get. His arrogance had been stripped away layer by painful layer, leaving behind a hollowed-out man he barely recognized. As he nursed a cheap coffee and picked at a day-old muffin, his phone buzzed with a news alert: Harmony Records acquisition, finalized by Montgomery & Reed. The deal was done. Another firm had stepped in where Blackwell Turner and Associates had failed. The article mentioned the record-breaking sale price, $2.6 billion, $200 million more than what Alexander had negotiated. Salt in an already gaping wound. He closed the browser tab and stared blankly at his laptop screen. The reflection in the dark display showed a man he wouldn't have recognized 6 months ago. His hair was longer, his face thinner, the sharp edges of privilege softened by humiliation and loss. The confident gleam in his eyes had been replaced by a wary caution, the look of a man who had been burned and was afraid of fire. The social isolation was perhaps the cruelest punishment. His social circle, built on status rather than genuine connection, had evaporated like morning dew. Former friends didn't return calls. Invitations dried up. He was no longer an asset to be cultivated, but a liability to be avoided. One morning, Alexander was walking down the street when he spotted a familiar face, Jason Morgan, a former colleague from Blackwell Turner and Associates. For a brief, hopeful moment, Alexander raised his hand in greeting. Jason's eyes met his. Recognition flashed, and then deliberately unmistakably, Jason turned away, crossing the street to avoid him. The rejection stung. It wasn't the first, but each one carved away another piece of his former identity, forcing him to confront the hollow nature of the relationships he'd built. They hadn't been friendships, but transactions, alliances of convenience with other climbers who had no use for him now that he had fallen. That evening, as Alexander trudged up the creaking stairs to his apartment, he found himself thinking about Michael Wilson's parting words. "You are not sorry for what you thought. You are sorry for who you said it to." For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that Wilson had been right. His apology had been transactional, a desperate attempt to salvage a deal rather than a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing. He had been sorry not for his prejudice, but for directing it at someone with the power to hurt him back. Inside his sparsely furnished apartment, Alexander collapsed onto a second-hand couch. The contrast to his former life was stark and painful. The Italian marble countertops had been replaced by chipped laminate. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park were now a single grimy pane facing an air shaft. The surround sound system that had once filled his home with crystal-clear music was now a small Bluetooth speaker that sometimes worked. That night, unable to sleep, Alexander found himself scrolling through news articles about Michael Wilson. Not the ones about their confrontation, but older profiles that detailed his journey from South Chicago to music industry titan. He read about how Wilson had been rejected by major labels before starting his own, how he'd slept on studio floors and worked 20-hour days, how he'd built Harmony Records with a vision of creating music that connected people across divides. For the first time, Alexander saw Michael Wilson not as the man who had destroyed his career, but as a human being with a story with struggles and triumphs that had nothing to do with him. It was a small shift in perspective, but it sent a tremor through the foundations of his worldview. The next morning, he woke with a strange sense of clarity. The catastrophe that had befallen him was entirely of his own making. It wasn't bad luck or circumstance or even Michael Wilson that had brought him low. It was his own actions, his own prejudice, his own failure to see the humanity in others. This realization didn't bring immediate peace or redemption. There was no lightning bolt of transformation, but it did create a small crack in the armor of self-pity and resentment he had been wearing since his fall from grace. And through that crack, a question began to form. What now? One evening, as Alexander was walking through his new neighborhood, a diverse working-class area he would have sneered at in his previous life, he passed a community center with a sign in the window. Volunteer tutors needed for after-school program. He paused, staring at the sign. He had time now. Too much time. And the emptiness of his days was becoming its own form of torture. What did he have to lose? The next day he returned and offered his services. The program director, a harried but kind woman named Maria Rodriguez, didn't recognize his name. She saw only a man with legal training who was willing to help high school students with their civics homework. She assigned him a small table in the corner of a noisy classroom, and for 2 hours twice a week, Alexander Reynolds, former titan of Wall Street, helped teenagers understand the basics of the American legal system. The first day at the community center was a shock to Alexander's system. The chaos, the noise, the casual disregard for his former status, all of it was disorienting. He sat at his assigned table, watching students rush past without acknowledging him, feeling more invisible than he ever had before. "Don't take it personally," Maria told him, noticing his discomfort. "They don't know you yet. Trust takes time to build. Trust takes time to build." The concept was foreign to Alexander, who had always commanded respect through position and power rather than earning it through character and consistency. This was a world where his Ivy League degree and former partnership meant nothing. Here he would be judged solely on what he could contribute. For the first few sessions, students trickled to his table reluctantly only when directed by Maria. They asked perfunctory questions, barely listened to his answers, and left as quickly as they could. Alexander found himself increasingly frustrated, his old arrogance threatening to resurface. Didn't they understand what an opportunity this was? Then, in his third week, a girl approached his table voluntarily, Ayesha Khan. 17, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a worn copy of the Constitution poking out of her backpack. She sat down directly across from him, studied his face for a moment, then said, "You're that lawyer from the video, aren't you? The one who got fired for being racist on a plane." Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. He'd been recognized. His instinct was to deny it, to defend himself, to retreat into the familiar patterns of deflection and minimization. But something stopped him. Perhaps the direct, unflinching way she was looking at him, not with malice or mockery, but with simple curiosity. "Yes," he admitted. "That's me." Ayesha nodded, apparently satisfied with his honesty. "I want to go to law school. Columbia, if I can get in. I have questions about the LSAT." And just like that, she moved past his infamy to what mattered to her, her future. Alexander found himself answering her questions about law school admissions, study strategies, and career paths. For the first time since his fall, he felt useful. Not powerful, not important, but simply of service. It was a strange feeling, but not an unpleasant one. Ayesha returned the following week with more questions. Then she brought a friend, Jamal, who was also considering law school. Slowly, Alexander's table became a regular stop for students with genuine interest in legal careers. They didn't defer to him the way associates at his firm had. They challenged him, questioned him sometimes, even corrected him when his information was outdated. But they listened, and gradually he learned to listen in return. One day, after a particularly intense session helping Ayesha prepare for a debate competition, Alexander found himself thinking about Michael Wilson's calm, analytical gaze on the plane. He had mistaken that look for arrogance, but now he wondered if it had been something else entirely, perhaps the same focused attention he was now learning to give his students. The work at the community center was humbling in ways Alexander had never anticipated. The teenagers had no interest in his former status. They evaluated him solely on his ability to explain concepts clearly and his willingness to take their ambitions seriously. They were unimpressed by credentials but deeply appreciative of genuine effort. It was a different world from the one he had inhabited, where worth was measured in billable hours and deals closed. Here, success meant Ayesha mastering a difficult concept, or Jamal gaining confidence in his writing. It was small-scale, unglamorous work that would never make headlines or earn millions. But for the first time in his life, Alexander found himself engaged in something that felt genuinely meaningful. As months passed, his role at the center expanded. He started a mock trial program drawing on his courtroom experience to help students understand the practical applications of legal principles. He watched with unexpected pride as they grew more confident, more articulate, more willing to stand up for their ideas. One evening, Maria approached him as he was packing up to leave. "You've been good for these kids," she said simply. "They respect you." The words hit Alexander with unexpected force. Respect. It was what he had always craved, what he had pursued through achievement and acquisition. But the respect Maria was talking about wasn't based on fear or deference. It was earned through consistency, through showing up, through treating these young people with the dignity they deserved. That night in his cramped apartment, Alexander opened his laptop to check his dwindling bank account. The freelance work barely covered his rent and basic expenses. His savings were rapidly depleting. Soon he would need to make some hard decisions about his future. As he scrolled through his emails, he noticed a news alert about Michael Wilson. Harmony Records had just launched a major new initiative, a music education program for underserved schools across the country. The article quoted Wilson. "Every child deserves the chance to find their voice, whether through words, images, or sound. Talent doesn't care about zip codes." Alexander stared at the screen, struck by the parallel paths they were now on. Wilson using his vast resources to create opportunities on a grand scale, while Alexander worked with a handful of students in a run-down community center. The difference in scope was staggering, but there was a common thread. Both were engaged in work that recognized and nurtured potential in unexpected places. For the first time since his downfall, Alexander felt a glimmer of something like purpose. Not the restoration of his former glory that was gone perhaps irretrievably, but something new. Something he had never valued before, the satisfaction of contributing to something larger than himself. Around this time, a new volunteer joined the community center staff. Elena Cortez, the woman who had confronted Alexander on the plane, now stood across the room organizing art supplies for a weekend workshop. Alexander felt a jolt of recognition, followed by a wave of shame. She had seen him at his worst, had called him out publicly. Now here she was in this small corner of Queens that had become his refuge. Their eyes met across the room. Elena's expression shifted from surprise to wariness. Alexander felt his heart rate accelerate, a familiar fight-or-flight response to confrontation. But instead of avoiding her gaze, he gave a small, awkward nod of acknowledgement. After a moment, Elena returned the gesture with a curt nod of her own, before turning back to her work. The next day, they found themselves alone in the break room. The silence was thick with unspoken history. So Elena finally said, stirring her coffee, "This is where you landed." Her tone wasn't kind, but it wasn't cruel either. It was neutral, evaluative. "It's not what I expected," Alexander admitted, "but it's been educational." Elena studied him, her gaze as direct and uncompromising as it had been on the plane. "The kids seem to like your program." It wasn't exactly an olive branch, but it was an acknowledgement. Alexander accepted it for what it was. They're smart, determined. They deserve better opportunities than they're getting. Something in Elena's expression shifted slightly, not warmth exactly, but a slight easing of suspicion. Yes, they do. From that point on, they established a careful professional detente. They weren't friends, but they could occupy the same space, work toward similar goals. Sometimes Alexander would catch Elena watching him interact with the students, her expression thoughtful, as if she were trying to reconcile the man before her with the one she had encountered on the plane. One afternoon, several weeks later, Elena approached his table as he was helping Aisha prepare for a critical scholarship interview. "You're doing it wrong," Elena said, not unkindly. "These kids don't need another white savior teaching them to assimilate into a broken system. They need someone who helps them navigate that system while keeping their own voice and identity." Alexander bristled at first, his old defensiveness flaring. But he forced himself to consider her words. "I'm just teaching them what I know about how the legal world works." "And that's valuable," Elena acknowledged. "But you need to understand that they'll face barriers you never did. The rules are different for them." It was a conversation that would have been impossible for the old Alexander to have, one that required him to listen more than speak, to consider perspectives fundamentally different from his own. But he wasn't the old Alexander anymore. That man had died a slow, painful death in the months since his disgrace. Gradually, their professional relationship evolved into something approaching mutual respect. They still disagreed often. Elena's approach was more radical, more focused on challenging existing power structures, while Alexander tended toward pragmatic navigation of those structures. But they found common ground in their commitment to the students. In Aisha, they both saw extraordinary potential. She had the sharp, analytical mind of a born lawyer combined with a passionate commitment to social justice. Elena helped her connect her legal ambitions to her community roots, while Alexander coached her through the practical realities of law school applications and interviews. When Aisha was named a finalist for a prestigious scholarship that would cover her full undergraduate and law school education, both Alexander and Elena felt a pride that transcended their differences. The day before Aisha's final scholarship interview, she approached Alexander with a question that caught him off guard. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "On the plane, I mean." "The video. Everyone's seen it. You must have known better." Alexander sat back in his chair, the familiar shame washing over him. But Aisha wasn't asking to humiliate him. Her expression was genuinely curious, seeking understanding. "I did know better," he admitted after a long moment. Or I should have. But knowing better isn't the same as being better. I spent my whole life in environments that rewarded me for looking down on people who were different, for believing my success made me superior, for treating people like they were invisible if they didn't have something I wanted. He paused, struggling to articulate something he was still coming to understand himself. I'm not saying that excuses it. It doesn't. But it's like I was trained to see the world a certain way to sort people into categories of useful and useless, and I never questioned it because it worked for me. Until it didn't. Aisha nodded slowly. So, what now? Are you just here because you have nowhere else to go? It was a fair question, one Alexander had asked himself many times. I started coming here because I had nothing else, he acknowledged. But I keep coming back because for the first time in my life, I'm doing something that matters to someone other than me. As the words left his mouth, he realized they were true. The community center had become more than just a refuge from his disgrace. It had become a place where he could contribute something genuine, something that couldn't be measured in status or money. Aisha seemed to consider this, her expression thoughtful. People can change, she said finally. My mom always says that, but they have to want to. The simplicity of her statement struck Alexander with unexpected force. People can change, but they have to want to. Did he want to? Or was he just adapting to circumstances, playing a new role until the old one became available again? He didn't have an answer yet. But the question itself marked a shift from seeing his current situation as a temporary humiliation to be endured to considering it as a potential turning point, a chance to become someone different from the man who had sneered at a family in first class. One evening, nursing a cheap beer and eating takeout from a carton, Alexander was aimlessly flipping through channels on his small television. He stopped on a local news program. A face on the screen made his breath catch. It was Michael Wilson sitting next to his wife Gabriella on a talk show couch. They weren't there to talk about music or best-selling books. They were announcing a new philanthropic foundation dedicated to funding music and arts education in New York City's most underprivileged schools. They spoke with a quiet passion that was both captivating and, for Alexander, deeply shaming. Gabriella discussed the proven link between arts education and compassion. Michael spoke of music as a universal language that could bridge the divides of wealth and race. Every kid deserves a chance to find their own voice, Michael said, his expression sincere and warm. Talent doesn't care what neighborhood you're from. Alexander stared at the screen, the carton of noodles forgotten in his hand. He saw them then, not as celebrities he had failed to recognize or as the instruments of his ruin, but as a family, a good, decent family, working to put something positive into a world he had only ever tried to conquer. He finally understood the depth of Michael Wilson's words on the plane. You are not sorry for what you thought. You are sorry for who you said it to. A profound and searing shame, purer than any self-pity he had felt before, washed over him. He had directed his ugliest instincts at people who embodied the very virtues, grace, decency, compassion that his life had so profoundly lacked. In the flickering blue light of the television and the shabby silence of his tiny apartment, Alexander Reynolds finally understood that the karma he'd received hadn't just taken his job or his fiancée. It had taken his delusions, leaving him with nothing but the devastating, undeniable truth of the man he had been. The realization didn't come with a lightning strike of clarity or a dramatic vow to change. It arrived quietly, settling into his consciousness like a stone dropping into still water, the ripples spreading outward, touching every aspect of his life. Spring arrived, melting the last of the winter snow. Alexander continued his work at the community center, his role gradually expanding. He started a mock trial program for the high school students, channeling his courtroom experience into something constructive. He watched with unexpected pride as Aisha won a citywide debate competition, her arguments sharp and incisive in a way that reminded him of his younger self, before ambition had curdled into something toxic. The mock trial program quickly became the center's most popular offering. Students who had never considered legal careers began to see new possibilities for themselves. Alexander found himself drawing on skills he had taken for granted: his ability to construct compelling arguments, to anticipate counterpoints, to speak with clarity and conviction. But he was using these skills not to crush opponents or secure massive paydays, but to empower young people who had been told in 1,000 subtle and not-so-subtle ways that their voices didn't matter. Sometimes in the middle of coaching a student through a cross-examination or explaining a complex legal concept, Alexander would feel a strange sensation, a quiet contentment entirely different from the fierce elation of closing a deal or winning a case. It wasn't as dramatic or intense, but it was more sustaining, like the difference between a lightning strike and sunlight. His relationship with Elena remained complex. They weren't friends exactly, but they had developed a wary professional respect. She challenged him constantly, forcing him to examine assumptions he hadn't even realized he held. He found himself thinking more deeply about questions of justice and equity, concepts he had once dismissed as irrelevant to his climb up the corporate ladder. One day, after a particularly heated debate about the role of law in perpetuating or challenging inequality, Elena surprised him by asking, "Have you ever thought about teaching for real? I mean, not just volunteering." Alexander hadn't. The idea of stepping into a classroom as anything other than a guest lecturer dispensing wisdom from the heights of his success had never occurred to him. But now, stripped of that success, he found himself considering possibilities he would once have dismissed out of hand. "I don't have a teaching degree," he pointed out, "or any education credentials." Elena shrugged. "There are alternative certification programs, and community colleges often hire adjuncts with professional experience for legal courses." She paused, then added, with a hint of her usual directness, "You're good at explaining things when you're not being condescending. The students respond to you. It's worth considering." The suggestion lingered in Alexander's mind. Teaching, using his legal knowledge not to serve wealthy corporate clients, but to prepare students for careers that might serve their communities. It was so far from the path he had envisioned for himself that it felt almost like apostasy. And yet there was something appealing about the idea of building rather than extracting, of contributing rather than accumulating. The financial reality was also becoming increasingly urgent. His savings were dwindling. The freelance work was inconsistent. He needed a more stable source of income, and his prospects in the corporate legal world remained non-existent. His name was still toxic, his reputation unsalvageable. When Maria mentioned that a friend of hers taught at Queens Community College and had heard they were looking for adjunct instructors for their paralegal program, Alexander found himself asking for an introduction. 2 weeks later, he sat in an interview explaining his experience, and when directly asked, acknowledging the viral incident that had ended his corporate career. "I made a terrible mistake," he said simply. "It cost me everything, but it also forced me to reevaluate what matters. I can't change what happened, but I can try to use what I know to help others." To his surprise, the department chair, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Patel, seemed more interested in his commitment to the community center than in his fall from grace. "Our students need instructors who understand the practical realities of the legal system," she said. "Not just the theory. And they need people who believe in their potential. Do you—" The question caught Alexander off guard. Did he believe in these students' potential? Once he would have paid lip service to the idea while privately doubting it. But now, having worked with Ayesha and the others at the center, having seen their intelligence and determination up close, he found that he did. "Yes," he said, "I do." He was offered 2 classes for the fall semester: Introduction to Legal Research and Business Law Fundamentals. The pay was a fraction of what he had once earned in a day, but it was steady, and combined with his freelance work, it would keep him afloat. When he shared the news with Elena, she offered a rare, genuine smile. "Good," she said. Now make sure you're teaching them not just how to navigate the system, but how to question it." Alexander found himself smiling back. "I'm still working on that part myself." "Aren't we all?" Elena replied, and for the first time there was a warmth in her voice that suggested the possibility of friendship. As summer progressed, Alexander threw himself into preparing for his fall classes. He approached the task with the same meticulous attention to detail that had once made him a formidable corporate attorney, but with a new awareness of the diverse backgrounds and needs of his future students. He consulted with educators, read pedagogical research, and revamped standard syllabi to make them more accessible and engaging. In July, Aisha received news that she had won the scholarship. The entire community center celebrated, but no one was prouder than Alexander and Elena. They had supported her through every step of the application process, from drafting her personal statement to preparing for interviews. Seeing her excitement, her absolute conviction that she would one day return to her community as a lawyer fighting for justice, Alexander felt a vicarious hope he had never experienced before. It was Elena who suggested they all go out to celebrate herself, Alexander, Maria, and a few other center staff. They ended up at a small Dominican restaurant a few blocks from the center, eating mofongo and sharing stories about their most challenging students. Alexander found himself laughing more than he had in months, maybe years. As they were leaving, Elena fell into step beside him. "You're different," she said abruptly. "From the man on the plane." Alexander glanced at her, unsure how to respond. "I hope so," he finally said. Elena nodded. "You are. You still have your moments when you get defensive or talk over people or assume you know best, but you catch yourself now. You listen. You're learning." It was perhaps the closest thing to approval she had ever offered him. Alexander felt a strange mixture of gratitude and humility. "I have good teachers," he said, and they both knew he wasn't just talking about formal education. In August, Alexander received an unexpected email from a former client. Not a corporation, but an individual he had once helped navigate a complex contractual dispute. The man was starting a small nonprofit focused on providing legal services to immigrants, and had heard through the grapevine about Alexander's work at the community center. Would he be interested in doing some part-time consulting work? The offer was modest, but it was legitimate work that aligned with Alexander's emerging values. He accepted gratefully, adding another piece to the patchwork career he was building from the ruins of his former life. By the time September arrived, bringing with it the start of the academic year and his first official teaching position, Alexander's life had settled into a new rhythm. It wasn't the high-octane existence he had once led with its first-class flights and luxury hotels and power lunches. It was smaller, quieter, centered around work that directly touched other people's lives rather than abstractly increasing shareholder value. His first day in front of a classroom was terrifying. Despite all his preparation, despite years of commanding courtrooms and boardrooms, Alexander found himself sweating as he faced 28 diverse students, many of them working adults returning to school to improve their career prospects. They looked at him with a mixture of hope, skepticism, and simple curiosity. None of them knew or cared about his past glory or his public disgrace. They cared only about what he could teach them. "My name is Alexander Reynolds." He began, his voice steadier than he felt. "Welcome to Introduction to Legal Research. This course is designed to give you practical skills that will serve you throughout your legal career, whether as a paralegal, a legal secretary, or as a stepping stone to law school." He paused, looking at the faces before him, young and old, representing a dozen different ethnicities, each with their own story and ambition. The legal system can seem intimidating and exclusionary. For many of you, it may feel like it wasn't designed with people like you in mind, and historically, that's often been true. But the law is also a powerful tool for change, for justice, for creating the kind of society we want to live in. My goal is to help you master that tool. As he spoke, Alexander felt something shift inside him, a quiet certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because it was prestigious or lucrative, but because it mattered, because it was real. After class, as he was gathering his materials, a student approached an older woman with gray-streaked hair and determined eyes. "Professor Reynolds," she said, "I just wanted to say thank you. I've been a legal secretary for 20 years, and I'm finally getting the education I always wanted. Your class is going to make a difference for me, Professor Reynolds." The title felt strange unearned, but the gratitude in the woman's eyes was genuine, and it touched something in Alexander that all the corporate accolades and bonuses never had. This wasn't about his ego or his status. It was about being of genuine service. "You're very welcome, Ms. Garcia." Teresa Garcia. "Ms. Garcia, I'm looking forward to working with you this semester." As Alexander left the campus, walking through the diverse, vibrant Queens neighborhood that had become his home, he realized that his life had not ended with his disgrace. It had transformed. The man who had sneered at a black family in first class was gone, replaced by someone humbler, kinder, more aware of his own fallibility and the humanity of others. It wasn't redemption exactly, he had not earned that yet, and perhaps never would. But it was growth. It was change. It was a second chance he had never expected and now valued more than he could express. That evening, Alexander found himself thinking about the Wilson family again. Not with bitterness or shame, but with a strange, unexpected gratitude. Their dignity in the face of his ugliness had been a mirror reflecting back a version of himself he could no longer unsee. The fall had been spectacular and public, but perhaps necessary, perhaps overdue. 18 months after the incident that had detonated his former life, Alexander Reynolds stood at the back of a crowded auditorium at the Lincoln Center. He was there for the opening gala of the Wilson Foundation's Music Education Initiative, an event he had learned about through his work at the community center. 3 of his students were performing in the showcase, their talents nurtured by the very program Michael and Gabriella Wilson had established. Alexander wasn't supposed to be there. His name wasn't on any guest list, but Elena had secured a staff pass for him, knowing how much it would mean to the students to have him in the audience. He stood quietly dressed in a simple suit that bore no designer label, watching the performances with genuine appreciation. The Wilson family sat in the front row. He could see the back of Michael's head, Gabriella's elegant profile, the children taller now sitting attentively as young musicians from across the city showed what they had learned over the past year. Alexander felt no bitterness, no resentment. There was only a quiet acknowledgement of the strange symmetry of the moment. 18 months ago, his life had shattered because he had judged people based on appearances. Now he was here anonymous in the crowd, celebrating the success of students whose worth had nothing to do with their clothes or their bank accounts. As the event concluded and people began to file out, Alexander remained in his spot at the back, waiting for the crowd to thin before he approached his students to congratulate them. It was then that he saw Michael Wilson standing alone for a moment as Gabriella spoke with one of the program directors. Their eyes met across the auditorium. There was a flash of recognition in Michael's gaze, a moment of genuine surprise. Alexander felt his heart rate accelerate, a primal fight-or-flight response to seeing the man who had witnessed his worst self. But he didn't flee. Instead, he offered a small, respectful nod, an acknowledgement without presumption. To his shock, Michael returned the gesture with a slight nod of his own. It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation. It was something much simpler, a basic human acknowledgement between 2 people whose paths had crossed in a significant way. The moment lasted less than a second before Gabriella rejoined her husband and they moved toward the exit, surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. But it stayed with Alexander long after the auditorium had emptied. Alexander quickly sent back a congratulatory text to Aisha. His chest swelled with genuine pride, not the self-satisfied arrogance of his previous life, but something warmer and more generous. Her success felt meaningful to him, in a way that closing billion-dollar deals never had. As he prepared for his day, Alexander reflected on how much had changed. 2 years ago, he would have scoffed at the idea that he would find fulfillment in a modest existence helping teenagers from working-class backgrounds navigate the complexities of the legal system. His former self would have seen his current life as failure, a humiliating fall from the heights of corporate power. Now he understood that his previous definition of success had been tragically limited. The community center had recently secured additional funding, a small grant that would allow them to expand their programs. Alexander had been instrumental in writing the proposal, applying the persuasive skills that had once closed massive corporate deals to the more meaningful task of securing resources for underserved youth. That afternoon, as he sat with a group of students discussing their college applications, Maria approached him with an unexpected proposition. "We've been approved to hire a full-time program director for the Legal Education Initiative," she said. "The board unanimously wants to offer you the position." Alexander was stunned. "Are you sure my background is precisely why you're perfect for this?" Maria interrupted. "You understand both worlds. You can teach these kids not just how the system works, but how to navigate it with integrity, something you've learned the hard way." The salary was a fraction of what he had once earned. The office would be a corner desk in a noisy community center rather than a corner suite in a Manhattan skyscraper. But the offer represented something he had thought forever beyond his reach, a chance to rebuild not just a career, but a life with purpose. "I'd be honored," he said simply. That evening, Alexander met Elena for dinner at a small neighborhood restaurant. Over the past 2 years, their cautious professional respect had gradually deepened into a genuine friendship, forged through countless hours of working together, challenging each other and ultimately finding common ground in their commitment to their students. "Maria told me about the job offer," Elena said as they settled at their table. "Congratulations!" "Thank you," Alexander replied. "It's not what I imagined for myself, but it's real," Elena finished for him. "That's what matters." Alexander nodded, grateful for her understanding. 2 years ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted. I had my whole life planned out: partnership at the firm, maybe a judgeship. Eventually, the right wife, the right address, the right everything. And none of it was real. It was all just performance. "And now?" Elena asked. "Now I'm just trying to be useful," Alexander said. "To actually contribute something instead of just taking." Elena studied him thoughtfully. "You know, when I saw you on that plane, the way you looked at the Wilson family, I've been on the receiving end of that look my entire career. People who see my name or my face and make instant judgments about whether I belong." She paused. "I never thought I'd end up working alongside you, let alone considering you a friend." "I wouldn't have thought it either," Alexander admitted, "but I'm grateful for it." Over dessert, their conversation turned personal in a way it rarely had before. Elena spoke about her journey from a first-generation college student to museum curator to arts educator. Alexander shared stories from his early days as an idealistic law student before ambition and the corporate culture had reshaped his values. "You know," Elena said thoughtfully, "what happened to you was karma. No question. But what you've done since, that's been choice. Every day you've chosen to be different, to learn to listen. That matters." Her words touched Alexander deeply. He had spent so long seeing his transformation as something forced upon him by circumstance, rather than something he had actively participated in. But she was right. Somewhere along the way, he had begun to choose this new path, not just accept it as punishment. As they walked back to their respective apartments, a comfortable silence between them, Alexander found himself thinking about all the unlikely turns his life had taken. How his worst moment had led through pain and humiliation and loss to something unexpected and valuable. How he had found connection and purpose in a place he once would have dismissed as beneath his notice. The next morning, Alexander found a message from Michael Wilson's office in his email. The Wilson Foundation was expanding its education initiatives and looking for someone to develop a legal literacy program for high school students. Michael had seen Alexander at the gala and remembered his community center work. Would he be interested in consulting on the project? Alexander stared at the screen, a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was something equally powerful. Recognition of growth, of change, of potential value. It was a door opening where he had expected only walls. He wrote back, accepting the opportunity with gratitude and humility, promising to bring everything he had learned both from his former life and his current one to the project. The arrogant traveler who had laughed at a black family in first class was gone. In his place stood a man who had lost the world and found his soul. Some mistakes cost you a moment of embarrassment. Others cost you everything. But in Alexander Reynolds' case, losing everything had ultimately given him the one thing his wealth and status never could: a life of authentic meaning built not on appearance or power, but on substance and truth. What did you think of the karma Alexander received? Was it deserved too harsh, or perhaps exactly what he needed? Have you ever experienced a moment that completely changed your perspective on what truly matters in life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who might need this reminder about the true measure of a person's worth, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of transformation and growth. Remember, sometimes our greatest falls can lead to our most meaningful rises.